The alchemist does not begin in triumph. He begins in failure, in the recognition that something fundamental has fractured within the architecture of his existence. This is not the romantic despair of poets, nor the manufactured crisis of those seeking aesthetic suffering. It is the authentic collapse that occurs when the structures by which one has organized meaning suddenly reveal themselves as insufficient, hollow, or false. The Nigredo, the blackening, emerges from this recognition. In the Hermetic tradition, it represents the first and most brutal stage of the alchemical opus, the putrefaction of prima materia, the dissolution of base substance before any transformation becomes possible. Yet to speak of it merely as a stage risks sanitizing what is fundamentally an encounter with annihilation. The aspirant does not choose the Nigredo. It chooses him, often at the precise moment when his defenses are most carefully constructed, his identity most rigidly defined. Jung understood this threshold not as metaphor, but as psychological necessity. In his analysis of alchemical symbolism, he recognized that the blackening represented the confrontation with the shadow, those aspects of the psyche that consciousness has rejected, repressed, or simply failed to integrate. But this confrontation is not a gentle dialogue. It is an immersion into chaos, a descent into what the mystics called the dark night of the soul, and what the alchemists termed mortificatio, the death that precedes rebirth. The modern individual, armored in psychological defenses and sustained by elaborate narratives of selfhood, rarely understands that transformation requires this death. He seeks growth without dissolution, evolution without entropy, gold without the crucible's fire. Yet the Hermetic wisdom insists there is no ascent without descent, no purification without putrefaction, no albedo without nigredo. The great work begins not in light, but in darkness so complete that even the memory of light seems a delusion. This is where the journey must begin, not in esoteric theory or philosophical abstraction, but in the lived experience of psychological dismemberment. The question is not whether one will face the Nigredo, but whether one will recognize it when it arrives, and whether one possesses the fortitude to remain within its depths long enough for the work to complete itself. For those who flee prematurely, the darkness returns, more insistent and more devastating with each evasion. The alchemical tradition emerged from a convergence of Hellenistic philosophy, Gnostic spirituality, and practical metallurgy in the crucible of late antiquity. Yet to reduce it to any single origin is to misunderstand its essential nature. Alchemy was never merely chemistry awaiting empirical rigor, nor was it purely mysticism disguised in material language. It represented a third way, a practice in which matter and spirit, substance and symbol, operated as inseparable dimensions of a unified reality. The central doctrine of alchemy posits that transformation is possible, but only through rigorous adherence to natural law. The magnum opus, the great work, consists of specific operations performed in specific sequence: nigredo, albedo, citrinitas and rubedo, blackening, whitening, yellowing and reddening. These are not arbitrary stages, but reflect the actual processes observed in metallurgical practice, elevated to the status of universal principles. The alchemist does not impose his will upon matter. He discerns and cooperates with the inherent potentials within it. This cooperation requires what the tradition calls solvet coagula, dissolve and coagulate. Before any substance can be purified, it must first be broken down to its constituent elements. Before any new form can emerge, the old form must be destroyed. This is not destruction for its own sake, but destruction as the prerequisite for authentic creation. The alchemist recognizes that nature abhors not a vacuum, but a falsehood. Any structure built on unconscious foundations, any identity constructed from borrowed materials, any meaning imposed rather than discovered. Jung's encounter with alchemy came at a critical juncture in his own psychological development. Following his break with Freud and his subsequent confrontation with the unconscious, documented in his Red Book, Jung found himself in need of a framework that could make sense of the archetypal material erupting from his own depths. The alchemical texts, with their strange imagery of dragons, lions, kings and queens, provided not just symbolism, but a map of psychological transformation. What Jung recognized was that the alchemists were not working on literal lead or gold, but on themselves. The prima materia, the base substance requiring transformation, was the alchemist's own psyche in its unintegrated state. The various operations, calcination, dissolution, separation, conjunction, represented specific psychological processes by which the conscious ego encountered, suffered, and ultimately integrated the unconscious contents it had previously rejected. The Nigredo, in this psychological reading, represents the necessary dissolution of the ego's defenses. Jung termed this process the integration of the shadow, the acknowledgement and assimilation of those aspects of personality that consciousness finds unacceptable. But this integration cannot occur through intellectual understanding alone. It requires what the alchemists called experientia, direct lived experience of the psychological material in question. This is where the Hermetic tradition diverges sharply from both academic philosophy and popular spirituality. Philosophy offers conceptual frameworks for understanding suffering. Spirituality often offers consolation or transcendence. Alchemy offers neither. It insists instead on endurance, the capacity to remain present within the suffering without premature resolution, without interpretive escape, without spiritual bypass. The alchemist does not seek to eliminate the darkness, but to work within it, to allow the dissolution to complete itself according to its own timeline and necessity. The central doctrine then is this: transformation is achieved not by will but by submission, not passive resignation, but active participation in processes larger than the ego's preferences. The alchemist does not choose what emerges from the Nigredo. He can only choose whether to flee from it or to provide the contained space, the vas hermeticum, the sealed vessel, within which the work can occur. This sealed vessel is both literal and symbolic. In laboratory alchemy, it prevents the volatile substances from escaping during heating. In psychological alchemy, it represents the capacity to contain unbearable affect without acting it out, projecting it onto others, or dissociating from it entirely. Jung called this capacity the temenos, the sacred precinct within which transformation becomes possible. Without this vessel, the Nigredo becomes merely trauma, overwhelming experience that fragments rather than transforms. With it, the same darkness becomes the prima materia of genuine psychological development. The difference lies not in the nature of the suffering, but in the container's capacity to hold it without shattering. This is why the alchemical tradition emphasizes preparation, patience, and above all the quality of attention brought to the work. The philosopher's stone is not found. It is forged through the sustained application of consciousness to unconscious contents. The descent into Nigredo begins with what the alchemists called calcinatio, the burning away of attachments, the reduction of complex structures to ash. In psychological terms, this often manifests as the collapse of previously held beliefs, the failure of relationships that once provided identity, or the sudden meaninglessness of pursuits that once seemed essential. The individual experiences this not as philosophical doubt, but as existential rupture, a fundamental questioning of reality itself. What characterizes this initial phase is disorientation, the familiar landmarks by which the psyche navigates. Professional identity, social role, personal narrative lose their coherence. The individual may continue performing the external functions of life while experiencing an internal hollowing out, a sense that the substance has drained from existence, leaving only empty forms. This is not depression in the clinical sense, though it may be accompanied by depressive symptoms. It is closer to what the existentialists termed angst, the anxiety that arises when the constructed meanings by which we organize experience reveal their contingency. The temptation at this stage is interpretation, to immediately assign meaning to the meaninglessness, to construct a narrative that re-establishes psychological equilibrium. This temptation must be resisted. The alchemical tradition insists on allowing the calcinatio to complete itself, to burn away not just the obvious attachments, but the subtle ones, the hidden identifications, the unconscious assumptions, the unexamined premises upon which the entire edifice of selfhood has been constructed. Following calcination comes solutio, dissolution, the liquefaction of what calcination has reduced to ash. Here, the boundaries of the ego begin to blur. The rigid distinctions between self and other, between conscious intention and unconscious impulse, between acceptable and unacceptable aspects of personality, start to lose their clarity. This phase is often accompanied by what Jung called flooding, the overwhelming influx of unconscious contents into consciousness. Dreams become vivid and disturbing. Emotions arise with unexpected intensity. Memories long suppressed surface with hallucinatory clarity. The individual may experience what feels like madness, the loss of the organizing principle that distinguishes sanity from chaos. Yet, this is precisely the point. The ego's organizing function, necessary for ordinary functioning, also acts as a censor, excluding from awareness whatever threatens its stability. Dissolution temporarily suspends this censorship, allowing the rejected materials to enter consciousness. The danger here is genuine psychotic breakdown, the permanent fragmentation of the ego, rather than its temporary dissolution. This is why the Hermetic tradition emphasizes the vas hermeticum, the sealed vessel. Without adequate containment, whether through therapeutic relationship, spiritual practice, or simple psychological resilience, the dissolution can become destructive rather than transformative. The line between mystical experience and mental illness is not absolute. It depends largely on the container's capacity to hold the process without shattering. As dissolution continues, the individual enters what might be called the coagulatio inversus, a false consolidation, a premature attempt to re-establish stability before the work is complete. This manifests as sudden conversions, dramatic life changes, or the adoption of rigid spiritual systems that promise escape from the chaos. The alchemists warned against this stage, recognizing it as the ego's attempt to abort the process and return to familiar ground. True coagulatio, genuine consolidation, cannot be forced. It emerges organically when the dissolution has reached its natural completion. But before this can occur, the individual must pass through what the tradition terms putrefactio, putrefaction, the rotting of the old self. This is the heart of the Nigredo, the deepest descent into darkness. Putrefaction is characterized by despair, not the acute despair of crisis, but the chronic despair of meaninglessness. Nothing works. No action produces satisfaction. No thought brings clarity. No relationship offers genuine connection. The individual exists in what feels like a living death, functioning mechanically while experiencing an internal deadness that colors every perception. This is the dark night of the soul that St. John of the Cross described, the state in which even spiritual consolation has been withdrawn. Jung understood this phase as the necessary precursor to individuation. The ego must experience its own insufficiency, must confront its fundamental inability to generate meaning through its own efforts, before it can open to the deeper sources of psychic life. The self, Jung's term for the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, can emerge into awareness only when the ego has exhausted its defenses and admitted its limitations. Yet this admission is not defeat, but liberation. In recognizing its insufficiency, the ego discovers its true function, not as the creator of meaning, but as the conscious participant in meanings that arise from depths it does not control. This is why the alchemists spoke of the work as both active and passive, opus contra naturam, work against nature, and opus secundum naturam, work according to nature. The alchemist must apply effort, but the effort consists primarily in creating and maintaining the conditions within which natural processes can unfold. During putrefaction, these natural processes operate below conscious awareness. The psyche is reorganizing itself according to principles the ego cannot observe. Dreams may become sparse or absent. Insight seems impossible. Progress appears non-existent. Yet this apparent stasis is profoundly active. The dead material is decomposing, releasing its elements so they can recombine in new configurations. The emergence from putrefaction is signaled by what the alchemists called the cauda pavonis, the peacock's tail, a brief appearance of iridescent colors in the blackened material. Psychologically, this manifests as sudden moments of clarity, brief experiences of meaning or beauty that interrupt the prevailing despair. These are not yet stable states, but glimpses of what is gestating within the darkness. These glimpses function as promises, evidence that the process is working, that the dissolution has not been merely destructive but preparatory. They do not end the Nigredo, but they make it bearable. They provide the motivation to continue the work, even when every rational assessment suggests abandonment. The transition from Nigredo to albedo, from blackening to whitening, is gradual rather than sudden. It consists not in the abolition of darkness, but in the development of a new relationship to it. The individual learns what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between opposites without collapsing into either pole. Light and dark, conscious and unconscious, order and chaos are experienced not as enemies but as necessary complements, each containing and defining the other. This new capacity transforms suffering from something to be eliminated into something to be engaged. The individual no longer seeks to escape discomfort, but to understand what it is teaching. Pain becomes information rather than merely sensation. Confusion becomes openness rather than merely disorientation. The darkness that once threatened annihilation now functions as the womb of transformation. Yet even as the worst of the Nigredo passes, its lessons remain. The individual who has undergone this descent carries forward an irreversible knowledge, the knowledge that all constructed meanings are provisional, that all identities are contingent, that the ground of existence is not solid, but fluid. This knowledge could produce nihilism, but in one who has completed the work, it produces instead a paradoxical combination of humility and confidence. Humility before the vastness of what remains unknown. Confidence in the psyche's capacity to navigate uncertainty without predetermined maps. At the nadir of the Nigredo, the individual confronts what might be termed the ontological void, the direct experience of meaninglessness not as philosophical concept, but as lived reality. This is distinct from ordinary depression or anxiety. It represents the collapse not of particular meanings, but of meaning itself, not the failure of specific hopes, but the apparent impossibility of hope as a category. The existentialist philosophers attempted to articulate this state through concepts like Sartre's nausea or Camus's absurd. But their intellectual frameworks, however precise, cannot fully convey the visceral quality of the experience. The physical sensation of reality's texture changing, becoming thin, unreal, dreamlike. The individual moves through the world as if behind glass, perceiving but not participating, observing but not inhabiting his own existence. This state often triggers what psychiatry terms derealization or depersonalization, the sense that the world or the self has become unreal. Yet these clinical terms pathologize what the Hermetic tradition recognizes as a necessary passage. The old reality must become unreal before a new reality can be perceived. The constructed self must feel alien before the authentic self can emerge. What appears as symptom is actually process. The crisis deepens when the individual recognizes that no external change will resolve the condition. A new relationship, a different career, a change of location. None of these address the fundamental problem because the problem is not situational, but existential. It concerns not the content of life, but the capacity to invest that content with significance. When this recognition arrives, despair intensifies because the usual strategies of amelioration reveal themselves as futile. Jung observed that many of his patients reach this point in midlife, though it can occur at any age when the psychological structure can no longer contain what it has repressed. He termed it the confrontation with the self, the moment when the ego encounters the totality of the psyche and realizes its own relative insignificance. This realization is simultaneously devastating and necessary. Devastating because it shatters the ego's illusion of autonomy and control. Necessary because only this shattering permits genuine relationship with the unconscious depths. The alchemical texts describe this moment through the imagery of the mortificatio, the death of the king, the dissolution of the sun, the descent into the underworld. These are not metaphors for something else, but precise descriptions of psychological experience translated into mythological language. The king represents the ego's sovereignty. His death represents the ego's submission to processes it cannot master. The sun represents consciousness. Its dissolution represents the temporary eclipse of rational understanding. The underworld represents the unconscious. The descent represents the necessity of engaging its contents directly rather than through defensive interpretation. What makes this phase genuinely dangerous is its duration. It is not a single dark night, but often months or years of sustained meaninglessness. The individual functions, works, maintains relationships, performs necessary tasks, but experiences these functions as mechanical, empty of intrinsic value. He becomes, in effect, an observer of his own life rather than its participant, watching himself go through motions that feel increasingly theatrical, performative, false. The temptation towards suicide is not incidental, but structural to this phase. When meaning collapses completely, when every attempted solution fails, when the future appears as nothing more than the indefinite continuation of an unbearable present, the question, why continue, arises with terrible logic. The Hermetic tradition does not sentimentalize this question or dismiss it with facile reassurances. It acknowledges the legitimacy of the question while insisting that the answer cannot be formulated in the midst of the crisis. What sustains the individual through this phase is rarely hope. Hope has been exhausted, but something closer to what Camus called metaphysical rebellion, a stubborn refusal to grant meaninglessness the final word, a commitment to see the process through, not because one believes in a positive outcome, but because premature termination would constitute a deeper failure than continued suffering. This is where the alchemical virtue of patientia becomes essential, not passive waiting but active endurance, the cultivation of the capacity to remain present within unbearable experience. The individual learns that he can survive what he believed would destroy him. That consciousness persists even when its contents are unbearable, that the psyche possesses resources hidden from ordinary awareness that emerge precisely when ordinary resources have been depleted. The crisis resolves not through finding answers, but through the transformation of the question. The individual stops asking, "Why is this happening?" and begins asking, "What is this teaching?" The shift is subtle but decisive. It represents the first movement toward meaning's reconstruction on firmer ground. The emergence from Nigredo does not restore the previous state. The individual who completes this passage is fundamentally altered, having undergone what the alchemists termed transmutation, not mere change, but transformation at the level of essential nature. What emerges is not the old self repaired, but a new configuration of consciousness, one that Jung called the individuated psyche. This new configuration is characterized first by spaciousness, an increased capacity to hold contradiction, ambiguity, and paradox without collapsing into premature resolution. The individual develops what might be termed negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainty without irritable grasping after fact and reason. This is not agnosticism or relativism, but a more mature epistemology, one that recognizes the limits of rational understanding while remaining committed to the pursuit of truth. Second, the individuated psyche demonstrates permeability, a more fluid boundary between conscious and unconscious contents. Dreams are attended to, synchronicities are noticed, intuitions are valued alongside logical analysis. The ego has learned that it is not the totality of the psyche, but its executive function, responsible for conscious decision-making, but dependent on information arising from unconscious sources. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the individual acquires what might be termed authorship, the capacity to live according to internal authority rather than external validation. The opinions of others, while considered, no longer determine the individual's sense of worth or direction. Cultural norms are engaged critically rather than absorbed unconsciously. The individual has discovered, through the ordeal of the Nigredo, an internal locus of evaluation that cannot be delegated to external authorities. Yet this newfound autonomy is paradoxically accompanied by deeper connection. Having confronted the shadow, the rejected, repressed, denied aspects of personality, the individual develops genuine compassion. He recognizes in others the same struggles he has faced, the same defenses he has deployed, the same suffering he has endured. This recognition dissolves the false boundaries that separate self from other, creating the possibility of authentic relationship, rather than the mutually defensive interactions that characterize unconscious relating. The integration is never complete. The alchemists spoke of the work as requiring constant repetition, constant refinement. Each layer of consciousness that is achieved reveals deeper layers requiring further work. But the individual who has completed the Nigredo possesses something that cannot be taken away. Direct knowledge that transformation is possible, that meaning can be found even in meaninglessness, that gold can be extracted from the basest materials. This knowledge manifests not as certainty, but as confidence. Confidence in the psyche's inherent capacity for self-regulation and self-healing when given adequate time and proper conditions. The individual learns to trust the process even when its direction is unclear, to endure the necessary suffering while refusing unnecessary suffering, to distinguish between pain that transforms and pain that merely traumatizes. The practical result is a life lived with greater intentionality and less reactivity, with deeper engagement and less defensive withdrawal, with more genuine joy and more authentic sorrow. The emotions are felt more fully because they are no longer threatening to the ego's stability. The relationships are more intimate because vulnerability is no longer equated with weakness. The work is more meaningful because it arises from internal necessity rather than external coercion. The individual has become, in the alchemical sense, a philosopher, not one who possesses wisdom, but one who loves it, who pursues it, who recognizes it as the highest value and organizing principle of existence. And this love, born from the depths of the Nigredo, proves more enduring than any love born from easier circumstances. The gold you seek was never in the crucible. It was forged in the will that refused to abandon the flame when all reason counseled flight.